Are you seeking fulfillment for your life? Do you want freedom from fear? That's why we're here. Welcome to Jesus 101, introducing you to the real Jesus. And now, here's your host, Elizabeth Talbot.
Welcome to Jesus 101. I am so excited that we're starting a second season of this program, and thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be doing the whole history of redemption, making the point that actually the story of Jesus is not a story that only happens at the cross or through the Gospels. Actually, the story of Jesus starts in the book of Genesis, and it ends at the end, in the book of Revelation, when we are back with God for eternity. That is the story of Jesus. This is the reason why the Bible was written. The Bible was written to tell us how God got his children back. Let me start by telling you a story, kind of a scary story. You know, when my dad was, he was the president of the Union. For those of you that do not know what that is, the Union is actually a big geographical place where there's an ecclesiastical administrator, a leader of the church that leads several countries sometimes, or several states here in the United States. Well, my dad was the president of the Union that included Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay when I was a little girl. And we were going through very difficult political times in Argentina at that time. And my dad was born in Uruguay. So one day, an anonymous letter arrived in the Union offices. And this letter, you know, they were getting anonymous letters all the time, like in any other country that is in political upheaval. But this letter said something that made all of us kind of stop and read it again. And this is what it said. It gave 24 hours for my dad to leave the country. Because he was born in Uruguay, the letter said, you have no right to be the president here in Argentina in these offices because you are from Uruguay. So we give you 24 hours to leave the country. And, you know, any crazy anonymous letter like this would have easily dismissed, except that this one carried a very heavy consequence. And this was the consequence. If he didn't do what they were telling him to do, I would be kidnapped. I am an only child, the only child of my parents. And they said in the letter, because they knew me by name, that your daughter, Elizabeth, would be kidnapped and you would never see her again. I remember my parents' faces. You know, I was too young to understand what being kidnapped meant. I didn't realize that I was in danger of losing my life in that process, but my parents did. So they prayed for a few hours, asking for God's guidance. They were involved in his work. They had devoted their lives to the ministry. And here they had to make a decision. They decided to stay in the country. And they gave me very specific instructions. When I went to school, or no matter where I was, I could not talk to any strangers. It was very interesting for me because we lived only 3 blocks from school. And I could not walk to school during that time because the threat was that I would be kidnapped. And so my parents said, you know, no matter what, no matter who stops you on the streets, you are not to talk to them. As a matter of fact, they announced this at the school too. Nobody could pick me up except my parents. Obviously, you know the end of the story because I'm still here. I was not kidnapped. But it was a very difficult and scary time for my parents and for my whole family. I don't think there's anything like losing a child. Do you remember the first time you held your baby in your hands? Do you remember, some of you that are young adults out there, you still have this as a very fresh image because maybe you're still holding your babies in your hand today. Remember that first day in the hospital when they gave you your baby? And then for hours when you brought your baby home and put it in the crib, you kept watching to see if your baby was still breathing. Do you remember those feelings of saying, this little person is my son, my daughter, and I never want to lose them, not even for a minute? Well, today we're going to start from the beginning. The story of God and his children. The day that God decided that he would have his own children. And in order to do that, we actually need to start in Genesis, because that's when it happens. So we're going to get our Bibles, and if you're home and you want to get your Bibles and perhaps a paper and a pen to write some things down, today I want to tell you what I consider to be the most important topic in all of the scriptures so that we can understand the plan of redemption. And it starts the day that God decides to have children. See, we are told in Genesis chapter 1 that one day God decided to have children. And so all of creation, all the days of creation before humankind is actually created, are built for the children of God. All of creation, whether it was going to be the plants or the flowers or the trees, they were all because of the babies that were coming. You know, you remember when you created your nursery at home for your children and painted, our producer has a little boy and he talks about him in such excitement. You know, I'm sure that the same thing happens to you. When you think of your children, well, God did the same thing. He decided to create just the perfect world for his children. And every day, whatever he created, he made a qualitative statement. He said, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good, until we get to the sixth day. The sixth day is the day when God actually has a dialogue among the Godhead. This is the only divine dialogue we have in all creation, where God actually says, I think it's time. Let's have children. You remember that dialogue with your wife or with your husband at the kitchen table? Saying, is it the time? Is it time to have children? What do you think? Well, God had that divine dialogue. Yes, I know that some of you had children without the dialogue, but in general, most of us have a dialogue that says, is this the time? And so God had the dialogue, and we are told here in verse 26 of Genesis 1 that God said, let us make mankind in our image. This is the dialogue among the Godhead. It's very interesting how God talks in plural here. Let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness. And let them rule over the fish of the seas and over the birds of the sky, etc., because God was going to share his power with his children, and they would manage this earth. And verse 27 reports that God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. Oh yes, finally God had children. And he looked at the children, and he could not call that day good like all the other days. Oh no, says the Hebrew. That day was special. It was different than all the other days. This day, says the Hebrew, was very good. And you can read this in Genesis 1, verse 31. That this day was special. All the other days were good. This day, well, it was very good. Because having a pet is good, and having a garden is good, but having children is very good. And so here we start the plan that God created his children to be in intimacy with him forever. And chapter 2 tells us that he actually created a nursery. He created a nursery, even though the whole world was perfect, he created a nursery for his children. Chapter 2 of Genesis, verse 8, the Lord planted a garden. And the word for garden in the Greek, you know that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but 200 years before Christ, it was translated to Greek. And that is the actual Bible that the New Testament writers used, the Greek Old Testament. Well, the Greek Old Testament in this verse tells us what the name of the Greek, of this garden is. The word in Greek is paradisos. The Lord planted a paradisos. This is where we get the word paradise in English. What a beautiful place. It was so beautiful that that's where we get the word paradise. And he planted all kinds of things. Remember when you put things on the ceiling of the nursery so that when your baby woke up and looked up, you would go, oh, this is so beautiful. Well, God did the same thing. We are told that out of the ground, the Lord caused, and in verse 9 of chapter 2 of Genesis, he caused every tree that is pleasing to the sight. This was not just for food. No. He wanted everything to be just beautiful. So he planted trees that were good for the sight and good for food. And in the middle of the garden, he placed a very important tree. It was the tree of life that reminded his children that they were eternal, the same way that their daddy was eternal. Now, in the narrative of Genesis, there is a key word that will explain the rest of the plan of redemption for us. And it's the word image. Chapter 1, verse 26 says that God decided to create his children in his image. They were like him, even not identical to him. And this word image, it's a word that is not a strange word. Actually, it's the same word that will be used later in Genesis 5 when Adam will have a child in his image. Same word. So God has the child in his image. Adam has children in his image. You have children in your image. And what would we do for our children? Oh, we would do anything. Well, one day, the children of God got close to another tree. This was called the tree of good and evil. It was just one exception of all the trees of the garden that would give them the freedom to choose moral independence. If they didn't want their daddy, God, to tell them what was good and what was evil, they could choose moral independence. They could choose that they didn't want God, that they could choose to say, thank you, God, because we know that you gave us life, but now we're on our own. So thank you, but no thank you. They could choose that. Even though God had told them, this is a very clear boundary. If you choose this, you will know you're trespassing it. Everything else means that you still want me. Well, one day, Eve came to this tree. As she found an animal that used to look a lot more beautiful than the serpents look now. The serpents then were beautiful animals, and Eve was mesmerized with the beauty of this animal. But this animal started talking to her. And we read on chapter 3 that the animal starts using the same tactics and making the same points that kidnappers do today. The first thing he says is, oh, God told you not to eat from any tree in the garden, which of course was a lie, because it was exactly the opposite. They could eat of all the trees, except this one, because this was their choice of independence morally. And so you can imagine the children of God talking to the kidnapper, and the kidnapper having exactly the same tactics as kidnappers have today. And the kidnapper said, oh no, you don't understand. God doesn't want what's best for you. I have candy. Come here, come with me. And the children of God start establishing a dialogue with the kidnapper. Eve doesn't realize that she is getting closer and closer to getting in the car. She doesn't realize that, like my parents had given very specific instructions, she doesn't realize that she's getting closer and a little too close. And the kidnapper keeps saying things like, oh, your daddy doesn't want what's best for you. I know what's best for you. Follow me. So after a dialogue that is a very sad dialogue, and it's interesting because even though Eve is the one being addressed by the kidnapper, all the pronouns are in plural because she's being addressed as the representative of the first couple and also as a representative of the human race. So she answers in we, in plural at all times. And so here we have the kidnapper, and the sad, very sad part of this whole dialogue that is at the very beginning of the Bible, because this is where the topic starts. The children of God choose. Oh, what a very sad day. They choose to leave with the kidnapper. And they would be in the kidnapper's arms from there on. And one of the saddest verses in the Bible is when they had to leave the paradiso at the end of chapter 3. they had to leave. Verse 24, he drove the men out. And at the east of the paradise of Eden, he stationed cherubim because they could not longer have access to the tree of life. That was the symbol that they were eternal because they were children of the life giver. Now, God could have said, well, there you go. Those were my children, but I'll go home and make another one because that one didn't work, did it? Yeah, but that's a ridiculous thought because that's not what you would do if your child gets in trouble. If your child does what you told them not to do, and they find themselves in the hands of the kidnapper, or in the bottom of a pool that you told them not to go to, or if they find themselves sick because they did something or ate something you told them not to eat, you would not leave your kids and say, okay, here, you got what you deserve. No, you would spend the rest of your life trying to rescue your child. I don't know if you ever lost a child for a moment. I've seen mothers in the mall who are desperate because they lost their child for 2 minutes. They show you photos. They stop passersby. It doesn't really matter because they don't care about their honor. All they want is their babies back. Well, the first promise that God gives, the first promise that we have called the covenant, is in Genesis 3:15. And God actually gives it to the kidnapper. He does it in the presence of Adam and Eve. But he does it to the kidnapper. He tells him, Genesis 3:15, and I quote from the Hebrew, I'm going to crush your head. I'm going to crush your head, says God. What would you have told a kidnapper that took your children away? Wouldn't you have, with all the passion that a parent can have, wouldn't you have said, I'm going to crush your head. You're not getting away with this. Maybe you have my children now, but I'm coming back. I'm getting them back. And this is our first promise in the Bible, Genesis 3:15, that says, yes, I will put enmity between the woman and between your seed. You will cause us some trouble. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Yes, you will get us in the heel, but we, says God, I'm going to crush your head. And this is where the story of redemption actually starts. And the concept that I want to share with you right now is a concept that has changed my life and my ministry when I finally understood why is it that God actually decided not to just leave us alone, but to rescue us. First of all, if you look at salvation from a parent's perspective, you will understand why is it that God got so desperate when he lost his children. Unfortunately, sometimes we have a different view of God. We have a view of a very stern God who doesn't love us and who we have to please in order for him to like us. But that is not the biblical picture of God. The biblical picture of God is of a desperate parent who lost his children. And now I want to tell you a concept that, like I said, it has changed my life. The concept is the concept of the Goyle. Write it down. G-O-E-L, Goyle. It's a word in Hebrew, very, very similar to Noel in Christmas, but with a G. G-O-E-L. The concept of the Goyle is what explains to us the whole plan of redemption. And actually, I wrote a book that is the missionary book of the year for this year and next year called Surprised by Love, the Unexpected Rescue of God's Children. This whole book is based on the plan of salvation from a parent's perspective. This is a book you want to give somebody to understand the plan of salvation. How much God actually loved us, that he left heaven for us. And it develops the concept of the Goyle. The concept of the Goyle is what will hold the Bible together. And I'm actually going to read a couple places here. The Goyle was the kinsman redeemer. We actually have several places in the Bible where God teaches the concept of the closest of kin, the kinsman redeemer. Now, the closest of kin, the kinsman redeemer, could do things for his family that nobody else could do. As a matter of fact, the closest of kin, the kinsman redeemer, the Goyle, could do 5 roles, of which some of the most important were that he could buy a relative who had been enslaved because of his debt. Let's say that you had a debt and you couldn't pay for it. And so you gave yourself up into slavery because of that. Your Goyle, your kinsman redeemer, could come and pay your price. So I'm going to read here in page 43 of this book. To redeem a relative who had been sold into slavery. And then I quote the actual verse in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 47 to 54. If one of you has given yourself into slavery, one of your brothers may redeem you, or one of your blood relatives, because the closest of kin could come and pay the price. But that wasn't the only role. He could also redeem the property back. Let's say that you lost your property because of debt. The kinsman redeemer, the Goyle, the closest of kin, could come and buy the property back so it could go back to your family again. He could do 3 other things. He could buy descendants for his brother who died without descendants, so they would marry the widow. And the whole book of Ruth is actually based on this topic. He could appear in court instead of the relative, and he could avenge the blood if the relative was killed innocently. Well, now that you know about the Goyle, let me tell you the punchline. This is the thread of gold that goes throughout the whole Bible. When God created us in His image, He became our closest of kin, and therefore, He obligated Himself to rescuing His children the same way that you would if your children got in trouble, if they got kidnapped, if they ended up in the bottom of a pool, if they ended up sick. Because God, when He created us in His image, He becomes our Goyle. So that one of the main names for God in the Bible is Goyle. Every time that in your English Bible you see the word Redeemer, you're seeing actually the word Goyle. That means kinsman redeemer, closest of kin, especially in the prophet Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah has many times made it into a verb, goeled you. Do not be afraid, Isaiah 43:1, for I have goeled you. I have called you by name. You're mine. So Jesus becomes our Goyle in the Bible. He does all 5 roles of the closest of kin. He pays our price on the cross to get us back for good. He also buys our property back. That's why the new earth is here, in the same world, because He gets the world back. And He also appears in court instead of us, and He also buys a descendants for God from a race that was dead. That's why Isaiah 53 says, you will see your descendants and be satisfied. He also avenges our blood at the end of times. Jesus becomes our Goyle, our kinsman redeemer. Now, if you get this, all of a sudden, you're understanding the plan of salvation. Because the Goyle will be the main story of the Bible. How the closest of kin came and crushed the head of the kidnapper the way that He has said He would do. This is such a fascinating concept that when you get it, then you understand that the whole Bible is about one topic, and one topic only: how God rescued His children from the kidnapper. That's why when we finish the Bible, we get this final hug from God that says, finally, you're back with me. Because you see, the whole Bible is what I will call a photo of the missing children. See, when the kidnapper got the children of God and said, okay, you're mine now. From Genesis 3 on, the whole Bible is what we would call a sign that says, my children have been kidnapped. A sign that says, my children, the one I love, the one, like a mother does on the mall. Look at the photo of my child. Look at the photo. Have you seen my child? Where the whole Bible actually is a photo of the missing children and the covenant that God made with them to come back. Remember that we said that God said to the children, to the serpent, I'm coming back for them. I'm going to crush your head. Well, this is what the covenant is. We go throughout the Bible with this missing sign. My children have been kidnapped. My children are missing. I'm coming back for them. And we are going to live together for eternity. So when we get to the book of Revelation, and the covenant is repeated many times, and we're going to see this in this series. It's going to be given to Adam, and then to Noah, and then to Abraham, and then to Moses, to David, and Jesus comes as the Goyle, as the kinsman redeemer. Well, when we get at the very end, this covenantal phrase that we have throughout the Bible that says, I'm their God and they're my children, comes true. And the first 3 chapters of Genesis are reversed in the last 3 chapters of Revelation. Because we have creation and then intimacy of God with his children, and then sin comes into the world. Well, Revelation 20, sin is destroyed forever. Revelation 20. Then Revelation 21, we get intimacy again with God. And God says, finally, verse 7, I will be their God and he will be my son. My children will be back with me. This big hug at the end of times says, oh, finally, I got you back. I mean, imagine if you lost your child. With what passion you would wait for that day to hug your children back. And so here we have, at the end of times, in chapter 22, the new earth created again. And guess what? The tree of life is there one more time. So the Bible comes full circle. The Bible is just a big kidnap, missing sign. It's the sign that says, I'm coming back for my children. So if you understand that at the cross, what Jesus did was actually to pay. He came to pay the price for the closest of kin. He came to pay the price for his kidnapped children. He came to pay the ransom, and that's why we have that word. But at the cross, he paid the ransom already. So that's why you can celebrate your redemption. But very soon at the second coming, God will not need photos anymore or the covenant, because it will be over. It will be over because very, very, very soon, God is coming back for us. Our Goyle paid the ransom, and we're about to get that final hug that says, we are together forever. We will never, never be separated again. Oh, don't you want to be there that day when God gives our hug and says, I paid a pretty costly ransom for you. It's true, but it was all worth it because I get to have you for eternity.